I still remember the exact weight of the phone in my hand when my daughter told me I was worthless. Not in those words, of course. Rachel was always too polished for that. Too educated. Too careful with her syllables. But when she said, "Mom, you're the failure here," with that cold, clinical tone she uses when she's explaining spreadsheets to her employees, I felt something inside me crack clean through. Like ice on a March morning. You don't see it happen. You just hear it. And then you fall. Before I go any further, I need you to do something for me. Comment below and tell me where you're watching this from. Your city, your state, your country. Because what I'm about to tell you, it happened in a quiet suburb in Pennsylvania, but I know this story lives everywhere. Betrayal doesn't have a zip code. And if you've ever been made to feel small by someone you gave everything to, you're going to understand every single word I'm about to say. Hit that subscribe button right now, because you're going to want to hear how this ends. And check the description box below, there are more stories like mine there, stories about survival, about coming back from the edge, about taking your power back when everyone thinks you've lost it forever. My name is Eleanor. Eleanor Louise Brennan. I'm 63 years old now, though some days I feel 103, and other days I feel like I'm still that bright-eyed girl who believed hard work and unconditional love could build an unshakable life. I was wrong about that. Dead wrong. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it really started. Not the phone call. That was just the earthquake. I'm talking about the years of hairline fractures that came before it. I raised Rachel by myself from the time she was 7 years old. Her father, Tom, walked out on us in 1998 with nothing but a duffel bag and a secretary named Jennifer who wore too much perfume and laughed too loud at his jokes. I came home from my shift at the hospital. Back then I was working as a nurse's aide, 12-hour shifts that left my feet swollen and my back screaming, and found a note on the kitchen table. Not even a real letter. Just a yellow post-it note stuck to the sugar bowl. I can't do this anymore. Don't look for me. Rachel cried herself to sleep for months. She'd wake up asking if Daddy was coming back, and I'd hold her and lie through my teeth, telling her everything was going to be okay. I didn't know if it would be. I was 28 years old, alone, with a mortgage I could barely afford and a daughter who needed me to be two parents in one body. So I became them both. I worked doubles. I picked up weekend shifts. I learned how to fix the leaky faucet and mow the lawn and change the oil in our beat-up Honda Civic. I went without new clothes for 3 years straight so Rachel could have the school supplies she needed, the field trip money, the birthday parties with her friends. When she wanted to join the volleyball team in high school, I took on a third job cleaning offices at night because the uniform and travel fees were more than I'd budgeted for. I was tired. God, I was tired. But I was happy, too, because Rachel was thriving. She was smart, scary smart. Straight A's all through school. Full scholarship to Penn State. She graduated summa cum laude with a degree in finance, and I was there in the audience, crying so hard I could barely see her walk across that stage. I was so proud I thought my chest would burst open. She got a job at her investment firm in Philadelphia right out of college. Started at the bottom, worked her way up. By the time she was 30, she was making more money in a month than I'd made in a year. She bought herself a sleek condo in Rittenhouse Square, wore tailored suits that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, drove a car I couldn't even pronounce the name of. And I was still proud. Still so proud. She met Gregory at a work conference in 2015. Gregory Allen Whitmore. I'll never forget that name, though I wish I could scrub it out of my memory with bleach. He worked in private equity, came from old money, the kind of family that has a summer house and a winter house and acts like that's normal. His mother, Patricia, was the kind of woman who wore pearls to the grocery store and looked at you like you were dirt on her shoe if you didn't know which fork to use at dinner. I met them at Rachel's engagement party. It was at some upscale restaurant in downtown Philadelphia, all white tablecloths and waiters who whispered instead of talked. I wore my best dress, a navy blue number I'd bought on clearance at Macy's 5 years earlier, and I felt out of place the moment I walked in. Patricia looked me up and down like I was a stain. Gregory's father, Charles, shook my hand with the kind of limp grip that told me he thought I was beneath him. But Rachel was glowing. She was happy. So I smiled and made small talk and pretended I didn't notice the way Patricia steered the conversation away from me every time I opened my mouth. They got married in 2016. Big wedding. 200 guests. A venue that looked like a literal castle. I wasn't asked to help plan anything. Patricia handled it all, and Rachel didn't push back. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself the only thing that mattered was Rachel's happiness. I gave her $5,000 as a wedding gift. It was everything I'd saved over 2 years. Every penny I'd scraped together from extra shifts and skipped lunches and turning the heat down in winter. I put it in a card and handed it to her the morning of the wedding. She barely looked at it. Just said, "Thanks, Mom," and set it on the gift table with the others. Patricia gave them $50,000. And a car. And paid for their honeymoon to Bali. I should have seen it then. The way Rachel's eyes lit up when Patricia handed her that check. The way she hugged her new mother-in-law and gushed about how generous she was. The way she looked at my card like it was a grocery store coupon. But I didn't want to see it. I wanted to believe my daughter still loved me. That all those years of sacrifice meant something. That I still mattered. The first few years of Rachel's marriage were okay. She called me every couple of weeks. We'd have lunch once a month or so, though she was always busy, always rushing off to another meeting or another dinner party with Gregory's colleagues. I'd ask about her life, and she'd give me the highlight reel. Work was great, Gregory was great, they were thinking about buying a bigger house. She never asked much about me. Never asked how I was managing on my own, now that I'd retired early due to a back injury that left me with chronic pain and a disability check that barely covered my bills. Never asked if I needed anything. I didn't want to burden her. She was building her life. I told myself that was enough. Then, in 2019, Rachel and Gregory bought a house. Not just any house, a sprawling 5-bedroom colonial in the suburbs with a pool and a 3-car garage. I saw pictures on Facebook before she even told me about it. She posted photos of herself and Patricia standing in the kitchen, champagne glasses raised, caption, "So grateful for the best mother-in-law in the world who made this dream possible." I stared at that post for 20 minutes. My hands were shaking. I called Rachel that night. Asked her about the house. She was breathless with excitement, told me all about the marble countertops and the heated floors and the finished basement. Then she mentioned, almost casually, that Patricia had given them the down payment. $200,000. I couldn't breathe. I said, that's amazing, honey. I'm so happy for you." She said, "I know, right? Patricia is just incredible. She's been so supportive." I wanted to ask, what about me? What about all the years I supported you? What about the nights I went without so you could have? But I didn't. I just said, "That's wonderful, Rachel. I'm really happy for you." She said, "Thanks, Mom. I gotta go, we're meeting the interior designer in 10 minutes. And that was it. She hung up. No invitation to see the house. No acknowledgement of anything I'd ever done. I sat in my small, cramped living room in my tiny rental house. I'd lost the house I'd bought when Rachel was a kid because I couldn't keep up with the mortgage after my injury, and I cried. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes were so swollen I couldn't see straight. But I told myself it was okay. She was happy. That was all that mattered. Then came the apartment. In early 2021, Rachel called me. It was the first time she'd called in almost 3 months. I was so happy to hear her voice I almost didn't notice the flatness in it. She told me Patricia's arthritis was getting worse and she didn't want to live alone anymore. So Rachel and Gregory had bought her a luxury apartment in a retirement community. Not just any apartment, one of those high-end places with a concierge and a fitness center and a full-time nursing staff on call. The rent was $8,000 a month. Rachel was paying it. All of it. She told me this like it was the most normal thing in the world. Like it was obvious that she'd spend nearly $100,000 a year on her mother-in-law's comfort. I said, voice shaking, that's very generous, Rachel." She said, "Well, she's family. And she's done so much for us." I didn't say anything. My throat was too tight. Rachel said, "Anyway, I just wanted to let you know. We're helping her move in next week." I said, "That's great, honey." And then I asked the question I shouldn't have asked. The question that changed everything. I said, "Rachel, I've been meaning to talk to you. My rent went up again, and with my disability payments, I'm barely getting by. I was wondering if maybe, just until I can figure something out, you could help me with a little bit. Maybe a few hundred a month, just to cover the difference." The silence on the other end was so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Rachel said, voice cold as winter, "Mom, I can't keep bailing you out. You need to figure out your own life. I said, Rachel, I'm not asking you to bail me out. I'm just asking for a little help. She said, you've always been like this. Always struggling. Always barely getting by. I've worked so hard to build something stable, and you're stuck. You're stuck in the same place you've always been. And honestly, Mom, it's exhausting. I felt like I'd been slapped. I said, Rachel, She cut me off. I'm sorry, Mom, but you're the failure here. You never planned ahead. You never saved. You never built anything. And now you want me to fix it. I can't. I have my own life. I don't remember what I said after that. I think I just hung up. I sat there in the dark, phone still in my hand, and I realized something. I didn't matter. I'd given everything, and it didn't matter. So I made a decision. I stopped calling. I stopped texting. I stopped checking Facebook for updates. I stopped asking how she was. If I was a failure, then I'd be a failure quietly. Alone. 3 years went by. 3 years of silence. And then, one afternoon in late summer 2024, my phone rang. It was Rachel. And she was screaming. The thing about silence is that it's never really quiet. For 3 years, I didn't call Rachel. Didn't text. Didn't send birthday cards or holiday greetings. Didn't comment on her Facebook posts, not that I looked at them anymore. I deleted the app from my phone 2 months after that last conversation. I couldn't bear to see her life unfold in glossy, filtered squares, knowing I wasn't part of it. People think cutting someone off is easy. Like you just decide one day and that's it. Clean break, no looking back. But it's not like that. Not when it's your daughter. Not when you carried her in your body for 9 months and held her hand through every nightmare and watched her grow into someone you barely recognize. Every day, I thought about calling. Every single day. I'd pick up my phone and pull up her number and stare at it until my vision blurred. My thumb would hover over the call button, trembling, and I'd imagine what I'd say. Rachel, I miss you. Rachel, I'm sorry. Rachel, please talk to me. But then I'd remember her voice, cold and cutting. Asterisk, you're the failure here. Asterisk. And I'd put the phone down. If you've ever been estranged from someone you love, you know this feeling. You know how it eats at you, how it sits in your chest like a stone. If you're watching this and you've lived through something similar, leave a comment and tell me your story. You're not alone. And if this is hitting close to home, do me a favor, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Check the description box below for more stories like this, stories about rebuilding yourself when the world tells you you're broken. Sometimes we need to know we're not the only ones fighting to survive. The first year of silence was the hardest. I kept expecting Rachel to reach out. To realize what she'd said, how much it hurt, and to apologize. I kept thinking, asterisk, she'll call on my birthday. She'll call on Christmas. She'll call because she misses me. Asterisk. She didn't. My birthday came and went. I spent it alone in my rental house, eating microwaved soup and watching old game shows. No card. No call. Nothing. Christmas was worse. I put up a small tree, just a tabletop thing I got at Walmart for $15, and I sat in front of it on Christmas Eve, crying so hard I thought I'd choke. I kept imagining Rachel as a little girl, the way she'd wake up at 5 in the morning on Christmas Day, bouncing on my bed, begging me to come see what Santa brought. I'd drag myself out of bed, bleary-eyed and exhausted, and watch her tear into presents I'd saved for months to buy. Where was that little girl now? Where was my daughter? I called my younger sister, Linda, that night. She lives in Ohio with her husband and 2 kids, and we talk every few weeks, though we're not as close as we used to be. I told her everything, the phone call, the silence, the loneliness that felt like it was swallowing me whole. Linda was furious. She said, Eleanor, that girl is out of her mind. After everything you did for her, she should be ashamed of herself. I said, I don't know, Linda. Maybe she's right. Maybe I am a failure. Linda said, don't you dare say that. You raised her by yourself. You gave her everything. If she can't see that, that's on her, not you. But it didn't feel that way. It felt like everything was on me. Like I'd done something wrong, made some mistake I couldn't even name, and now I was paying for it. The second year was quieter. Not easier, just quieter. The sharp edges of the pain wore down into something duller, heavier. I stopped expecting her to call. I stopped checking my phone every 5 minutes. I stopped imagining what I'd say if she reached out. I started to build a life that didn't include her. I got a part-time job at a local library, shelving books and helping with community programs. It didn't pay much, but it got me out of the house, gave me something to do with my hands. I joined a book club at the senior center. Made a few friends, other women my age who understood what it was like to feel invisible, to feel like the world had moved on without you. I tried not to think about Rachel. Most days, I succeeded. But then I'd see a mother and daughter laughing together in the grocery store, or I'd hear a song on the radio that reminded me of her, and the grief would slam into me all over again, fresh and vicious. By the third year, I'd almost convinced myself I was okay. That I'd accepted the way things were. That I'd moved on. I was lying to myself, of course. You don't move on from losing your child. You just learn to carry the weight of it. I kept living in the same rental house, a small, two-bedroom place on the edge of town with peeling paint and a leaky roof. The landlord kept promising to fix things, but he never did. The rent kept going up, and I kept scraping by, month after month, hoping I'd have enough left over for groceries after I paid the bills. I didn't tell anyone how bad it had gotten. Not Linda, not my friends at the library, not the women in my book club. I smiled and nodded and pretended everything was fine, because what was the alternative? Admitting I was barely surviving? Admitting my daughter was living in a mansion while I was one broken water heater away from being homeless? I had too much pride for that. Or maybe it was shame. I'm still not sure which. And then, in late August 2024, something changed. I was driving home from the library one afternoon, taking the long way because I didn't have anywhere to be and I liked the way the late summer light filtered through the trees. I turned down a road I hadn't been on in years, a winding country lane that used to be farmland but had been developed into sprawling estates over the past decade. I wasn't paying much attention, just letting my mind wander, when I passed a driveway. A long, tree-lined driveway that led to a massive house set back from the road. The kind of house you see in magazines. Stone facade, wraparound porch, immaculate landscaping. And there, parked in the driveway, was a car I recognized. Rachel's car. My heart stopped. I mean it. For a second, I thought I was having a heart attack. My chest seized up, my hands went numb on the steering wheel, and I had to pull over onto the shoulder before I drove off the road. I sat there, engine idling, staring at that driveway. My mind was racing. What was Rachel doing here? Did she live here? No, that didn't make sense. She and Gregory lived in the suburbs, not out here in the middle of nowhere. Was she visiting someone? Was this Patricia's new place? I didn't know. And I hated that I didn't know. I hated that I'd become a stranger to my own daughter's life. I should have driven away. I should have minded my own business and gone home and tried to forget I'd seen anything. But I didn't. I pulled back onto the road and drove slowly past the driveway, craning my neck to get a better look. The house was stunning, easily worth a couple $1 million, maybe more. There were cars parked out front, expensive ones. I saw people moving around inside through the big bay windows. And then I saw her. Rachel. She was standing on the porch, talking to someone I didn't recognize. She looked the same as I remembered, polished, put together, every hair in place. She was wearing a white blouse and dark jeans, and she was smiling, laughing at something the other person said. She looked happy. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. I drove home in a daze. I don't even remember the drive. One minute I was staring at my daughter on that porch, and the next I was sitting in my driveway, hands shaking so badly I couldn't get the key out of the ignition. I went inside and poured myself a glass of wine. Then another. Then another. I don't usually drink, but that night I drank until the world went soft around the edges and I could almost pretend my heart wasn't breaking all over again. I told myself it didn't matter. That Rachel had her life and I had mine, and that was just the way it was. But it did matter. It mattered so much I couldn't breathe. 2 weeks later, I drove past that house again. I told myself I was just taking a drive, but I knew I was lying. I wanted to see if she was there. Wanted to see her car in the driveway, proof that she existed, that she was real. The car wasn't there, but something else was. A for sale sign. Right there at the end of the driveway. Big, white, professional. Sold stamped across it in red letters. And that's when I realized. This wasn't Patricia's house. It wasn't a friend's house. This was Rachel's house. Rachel and Gregory's house. They'd bought another house. A bigger, more extravagant house. And they hadn't told me. I sat there on the side of the road, staring at that sign, and I felt something inside me harden. Not sadness anymore. Not grief. Rage. Cold, clear, focused rage. Because in that moment, I understood. I understood that Rachel hadn't just moved on from me. She'd erased me. I wasn't part of her life. I wasn't even an afterthought. I was nothing. And then, as if the universe was reading my mind, my phone rang. I looked at the screen. Rachel. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. I stared at her name for a long moment, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. And then I answered. Mom. Her voice was sharp, breathless, almost frantic. Mom, I need to talk to you. I said, voice flat, what do you want, Rachel? She said, Mom, she stopped. Took a breath. And then she said something I'll never forget. I drove past your place today. Where you're living. My blood went cold. I said, what? She said, I didn't know. I didn't know you were living there. Mom, that place it's a dump. How long have you been there? I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was too tight. She said, I need to ask you something. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me things were this bad? And that's when I heard it. In the background. Voices. Gregory's voice. Patricia's voice. All of them talking, muffled, like Rachel had her hand over the phone. She was with them. She'd driven past my house with them. And now she was calling me, not out of concern, but out of, what? Embarrassment? Shame? I said, voice shaking, Rachel, don't you dare. She said, Mom, I said, don't you dare call me now, after 3 years, because you're embarrassed. Don't you dare. She said, that's not. But I hung up. I hung up before she could finish. Before I could hear whatever excuse she was about to make. And I sat there in my car, shaking, crying, angrier than I'd ever been in my life. Because I knew. I knew what was coming next. Rachel showed up at my door 3 days later. I didn't invite her. Didn't tell her it was okay to come. But there she was, standing on my crooked front porch at 10 in the morning on a Thursday, wearing designer sunglasses and holding a Starbucks cup like she was stopping by for a casual chat. I opened the door and just stared at her. I didn't say hello. Didn't smile. Didn't move aside to let her in. She took off her sunglasses and I saw her eyes, red-rimmed, puffy. She'd been crying. Good. Mom, she said, voice soft. Can we talk? I wanted to slam the door in her face. I wanted to scream at her, tell her she had no right to show up here, no right to cry after everything she'd said, everything she'd done. But I didn't. Because despite everything, she was still my daughter. And some part of me, the part that had spent 3 years hoping she'd come back, was pathetically, desperately glad to see her. I stepped aside. She came in. She looked around my living room and I saw it through her eyes. The sagging couch I'd bought at a thrift store, the water stain on the ceiling that my landlord still hadn't fixed, the space heater in the corner because the central heating barely worked. It was small. It was shabby. It was nothing like the world she lived in. I saw her face tighten. Saw the pity in her eyes. And I hated it. I hated her pity more than I'd hated her silence. She sat down on the couch without asking. I stayed standing. She said, Mom, I didn't know you were living like this. I said, you didn't ask. She flinched. Good. She said, I should have. I should have checked in. I should have. She stopped. Looked down at her hands. I'm sorry. I laughed. Couldn't help it. A bitter, ugly sound that surprised even me. I said, you're sorry. You're sorry. She looked up at me, eyes shining with tears. She said, I am. Mom, I am so sorry. I said terrible things to you. Things I didn't mean. I was stressed and overwhelmed and I took it out on you, and that wasn't fair. I said, 3 years, Rachel. It's been 3 years. She said, I know. I know. And I don't have an excuse. I got so caught up in my life, in work, in Gregory's family, and I didn't realize how much time had passed. And then when I saw your place, when I realized you were struggling and I hadn't even known, her voice broke. I felt like the worst person in the world. I wanted to tell her she was. I wanted to make her feel every ounce of pain she'd caused me, but I was so tired. So tired. I sat down in the chair across from her. I said, "Why are you here, Rachel? Why now?" She said, "Because I want to fix this. I want to help you." I said, "I don't need your help." She said, "Yes, you do. Mom, you're living in a place that's falling apart. You're barely getting by. Let me help you." I said, "Like you helped Patricia?" The words came out sharper than I meant them to. Rachel went very still. I said, "You gave her $200,000 for a house. You pay $8,000 a month for her apartment. But when I asked you for a few hundred to help with rent, you called me a failure." Rachel's face crumpled. She said, "Mom, that was..." I said, Don't make excuses. You chose her. You chose Gregory's family. You made it very clear where I stand." She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. She said, "That's not true. Mom, I love you. I never stopped loving you." I said, "You have a funny way of showing it." We sat there in silence for a long moment. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the wall and Rachel's quiet sobs. Finally, she said, voice barely a whisper, "I want to make it right. Please. Let me make it right." I looked at her, really looked at her. My daughter. The little girl I'd raised, the woman she'd become. And I realized something. I didn't trust her. Not anymore. But I was tired. And I was broke. And I was too damn old to keep pretending I didn't need help. I said, "What are you offering?" She looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. She said, "I want to help you get a better place. Something safe, something comfortable. I'll cover the rent. Or I can help you buy something small, if that's what you want. And I'll make sure you're taken care of. Financially, I mean. So you don't have to worry anymore." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because you're my mother. And I should have been doing this all along." I said, "And what do you want in return?" She looked confused. She said, "Nothing. I don't want anything." I said, "Everyone wants something, Rachel." She said, "I just want you back in my life. I want us to be a family again." I didn't believe her. Not entirely. But I was too tired to fight. I said, "Fine. We'll talk about it." Relief flooded her face. She said, Thank you, Mom." She stood up, like she was going to hug me, but I stepped back. I wasn't ready for that. Maybe I never would be. She left a few minutes later, promising to call me in a few days to talk about next steps. I watched her drive away in her expensive car, and I felt nothing. Just a hollow emptiness where something used to be. If you've ever had someone try to buy their way back into your life after hurting you, you know how complicated it feels. Part of you wants to take it, because you need it. Part of you wants to throw it back in their face, because it feels like blood money. Drop a comment if you've been there. And if you're finding something in this story that resonates with you, hit the like button and check the description box for more stories like this. Sometimes we need to know we're not alone in the mess. Rachel called me 2 days later. She'd found an apartment for me, a nice one, she said, in a better part of town. 1 bedroom, updated kitchen, no leaks or broken heaters. The rent was $1,500 a month, and she'd pay it. She'd also set up a monthly allowance for me, $2,000 to cover groceries, utilities, whatever I needed. It was more money than I'd seen in years. It should have felt like a lifeline. Instead, it felt like charity. But I said yes. Because what choice did I have? I moved into the new apartment in early October. Rachel helped me move, her and Gregory both. He was polite, distant, the way he'd always been with me. I could tell he didn't want to be there, but Rachel had probably insisted. Patricia didn't come. Of course she didn't. The apartment was nice. Clean, bright, everything worked. I should have been grateful. And I was, in a way. But every time I looked around, I thought about the fact that Rachel had spent more on Patricia's down payment than she'd ever spent on me. And that thought sat in my chest like a stone. Rachel started calling me once a week. We'd have stiff, awkward conversations where she'd ask how I was settling in and I'd say fine and we'd both pretend everything was normal. It wasn't normal. It would never be normal again. But I played along. Because I needed the money. Because I didn't have any other options. And because, Despite everything, some small, stupid part of me still hoped we could fix this. I was wrong about that, too. It was November when Rachel invited me to Thanksgiving dinner. I almost said no. The thought of sitting at a table with Gregory and Patricia, pretending we were one big happy family, made my stomach turn. But Rachel asked me with such hopefulness in her voice, "Please, Mom, it would mean so much to me," that I couldn't bring myself to refuse. So I said yes. The dinner was at Rachel and Gregory's new house. The one I'd seen from the road, the one they'd bought without telling me. Rachel gave me the address and I plugged it into my GPS, watching the route unfold on the screen. It was a 40-minute drive from my apartment, out into the countryside where the houses sat on acres of land and cost more than I'd earn in 10 lifetimes. I drove there on Thanksgiving morning, hands tight on the steering wheel, trying to calm the anxiety churning in my gut. I kept telling myself it would be fine. Just a few hours. I could survive a few hours. I was wrong. The house was even more impressive up close. 3 stories, stone and brick, with tall windows and a circular driveway. I parked my beat-up Honda next to Gregory's Tesla and Patricia's Mercedes and felt like a stray dog that had wandered into a palace. Rachel answered the door. She was wearing a cashmere sweater and black slacks, her hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. She smiled when she saw me, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Mom, I'm so glad you made it. Come in, come in." I stepped inside and my breath caught. The entryway alone was bigger than my entire apartment. Marble floors, a sweeping staircase, a chandelier that probably cost more than a year's rent. Everything was pristine, perfect, cold. Rachel led me into the living room where Gregory and Patricia were sitting on a cream-colored sofa, sipping wine. Charles, Gregory's father, was there too, standing by the fireplace with a glass of scotch. They all looked up when I walked in. Patricia's gaze swept over me. I was wearing a simple dress I'd bought at Target, nothing fancy, and I saw the flicker of disdain cross her face before she hid it behind a smile. "Eleanor," she said, voice dripping with false warmth. "How lovely to see you." I forced a smile. "You too, Patricia." Gregory stood and shook my hand, his grip firm and impersonal. "Good to see you, Eleanor." Charles nodded at me but didn't say anything. He'd never liked me. The feeling was mutual. Rachel offered me a glass of wine and I took it, grateful to have something to do with my hands. We sat down and made small talk, weather, holiday plans, nothing that mattered. I felt like I was performing in a play where everyone knew their lines except me. Then Patricia said, voice bright and cheerful, "Rachel, darling, you must tell your mother about the surprise." Rachel's face lit up. She said, "Oh, yes. Mom, we have some exciting news." I braced myself. I didn't know why, but something in Patricia's tone set off alarm bells. Rachel said, "Gregory and I are expanding the business. We're opening a second office in Boston, and we're also investing in a property development venture with Patricia and Charles." Patricia leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "It's going to be quite the undertaking. We're purchasing a historic building downtown and converting it into luxury condos. The profit margin is extraordinary." I said, trying to sound interested, That's great. Congratulations." Rachel said, "The best part is, we're all doing it together. It's a real family venture." The way she said family made my chest tighten. I knew what she meant. Gregory's family. Not me. Patricia said, "Of course, it requires significant capital. But between all of us, we've managed to pull together quite the investment portfolio." I took a sip of wine and said nothing. What was I supposed to say? I had nothing to contribute. No capital, no investments, no seat at their table. The conversation moved on. They talked about contractors and architects and profit projections. I sat there, silent, feeling smaller and smaller with every passing minute. Then Charles said something that made my blood run cold. He said, "Rachel, your mother-in-law has been absolutely instrumental in getting this off the ground. I don't know what we would have done without her financial support." Gregory nodded. "Patricia's been incredibly generous. As always." Rachel reached over and squeezed Patricia's hand. "We're so lucky to have you." Patricia smiled, all gracious modesty. "Family takes care of family, darling." I set my wine glass down before I threw it. Rachel glanced at me, must have seen something in my face, because she quickly said, "Mom, how's the new apartment? Are you settling in okay? I said, voice flat, it's fine. She said, I'm so glad. I was worried about you in that old place. It just wasn't safe. Patricia said, oh, were you living somewhere unsafe, Eleanor? The way she said my name, like it was something distasteful in her mouth, made me want to scream. I said, keeping my voice even, I was living somewhere I could afford. Patricia said, well, it's fortunate Rachel was able to help you out. It must be such a relief. There it was. The subtle dig. The reminder that I needed help, that I was dependent on Rachel's charity. I said, yes. Very fortunate. Rachel said, Mom, don't. But I was already standing. I said, I need to use the restroom. I walked out of the room before anyone could stop me, found a bathroom down the hall and locked myself inside. I stood there, hands gripping the edge of the marble sink, breathing hard, trying not to cry. I looked at myself in the mirror. 63 years old. Grey hair I couldn't afford to color anymore. Lines around my eyes and mouth from years of stress and worry. I looked tired. I looked old. I looked exactly like what I was, a woman who'd worked herself to the bone and had nothing to show for it. I splashed cold water on my face and told myself to pull it together. Just a few more hours. I could survive a few more hours. When I came back, dinner was being served. We moved into the dining room, another massive space with a table that could seat 12. Rachel had cooked a turkey and all the trimmings, everything picture perfect like something out of a magazine. We sat down. Patricia at one end of the table, Charles at the other. Gregory and Rachel on one side, me on the other, alone. Charles said grace. We started eating. And that's when it happened. Patricia said, Eleanor, Rachel tells me you worked as a nurse's aide for many years. I said, that's right. She said, and you retired early due to an injury, was it? I said, yes. A back injury. She made a sympathetic noise. How unfortunate. It must be difficult, living on disability. I said, I manage. She said, still, it's remarkable how some people are able to build such stable lives, and others. She trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Gregory shifted uncomfortably. Rachel stared at her plate. I said, voice tight, others what, Patricia? She blinked, all innocence. Oh, I didn't mean anything by it. I just think it's wonderful that Rachel is in a position to help you. Not everyone is so lucky. I set my fork down. I said, you're right. Not everyone has a daughter who'll give them $200,000 for a house and pay $8,000 a month for their apartment. The table went silent. Patricia's face hardened. She said, I beg your pardon. I said, Rachel's been very generous with you. Much more generous than she's been with me. Rachel said, Mom, please. I said, I'm just stating facts, Rachel. You gave Patricia $200,000 as a down payment. You pay her rent every month. And when I asked you for a few $100s to help with my bills, you called me a failure. Rachel's face went white. I didn't, that's not. Patricia said, voice icy, Eleanor, I think you're being very unfair. Rachel has helped you considerably. You're living in an apartment she's paying for. She's giving you a monthly allowance. What more do you want? I looked at her, this woman in her designer clothes with her perfect hair and her smug, superior expression, and something inside me snapped. I said, I want the same thing you got. Recognition. Appreciation. To be treated like I matter. Patricia said, if you mattered more to Rachel, perhaps she would have done more for you. But clearly, actions speak louder than words. I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the floor. I said, you're right. Actions do speak louder than words. And Rachel's actions have made it very clear where I stand. Rachel was crying now. She said, Mom, please, that's not fair. I said, you gave her everything. Everything. And you gave me scraps. And then you invited me here to watch you celebrate how wonderful she is, how much she's done for you. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think I was too stupid to see it? Rachel said, I love you, Mom. I love you both. Why can't you understand that? I said, because love isn't supposed to look like this, Rachel. Love isn't supposed to feel like I'm begging for crumbs while she gets the whole damn feast. Gregory said, Eleanor, I think you need to calm down. I said, don't tell me to calm down. Don't you dare. Patricia stood up, face twisted with anger. She said, how dare you come into this house and speak to us this way? Rachel has done nothing but try to help you, and this is how you repay her? With jealousy and bitterness. I said, I'm not jealous. I'm heartbroken. There's a difference. Rachel said, voice breaking, Mom, please. Please don't do this. I looked at my daughter, my beautiful, successful, ungrateful daughter, and I felt something inside me harden into stone. I said, I raised you by myself. I worked 3 jobs so you could have what you needed. I went without so you could have more. And you turned around and gave everything to her. Everything. And you act like I should be grateful for the scraps you throw my way. Rachel said, that's not. I said, I'm done, Rachel. I'm done pretending this is okay. I'm done pretending we're a family. Because we're not. Not anymore. I walked out, grabbed my coat from the entryway and walked out the front door without looking back. Rachel followed me. She stood on the porch, crying, calling my name. Mom. Mom, please. Don't leave like this. I got in my car. Started the engine. She ran down the steps, still calling for me. Mom. Please. I backed out of the driveway and drove away. In my rearview mirror, I saw her standing there in the driveway, arms wrapped around herself, crying. And I felt nothing. I drove home in silence. No radio, no tears, no emotion. Just a cold, empty numbness. When I got back to my apartment, I sat in the dark for hours, thinking. And I realized something. Rachel hadn't invited me to that dinner because she wanted me there. She'd invited me so she could show me, show everyone, how generous she was. Look at me, helping my poor, struggling mother. Look at what a good daughter I am. It was performative. All of it. The apartment, the money, the phone calls. She didn't want a relationship with me. She wanted to feel good about herself. And I was done being her charity case. That night, I made a decision. If Rachel wanted to treat me like I didn't matter, then fine. I'd show her what it felt like to lose someone who actually loved her. I'd show her what it felt like to be alone. I didn't speak to Rachel for 2 months after that Thanksgiving dinner. She tried. Oh, she tried. She called me 17 times in the first week alone. Left voicemails, each one more desperate than the last. Mom, please pick up. We need to talk about this. I'm sorry. Please. Text messages that filled my phone. I never meant to hurt you. You're twisting everything. Patricia didn't mean it the way it sounded. Please talk to me. I deleted every single one without responding. By the second week, Gregory started calling too. His messages were different, stiffer, more formal. Eleanor, this situation has gotten out of hand. Rachel is very upset. I think we need to have a conversation like adults. Like adults. As if I was the one behaving like a child. I blocked his number. Patricia never reached out. Of course she didn't. I'm sure she was thrilled I was out of the picture. The thing is, people think when you cut someone off, you feel powerful. Free. Like you've taken control of the situation. But that's not how it feels at all. It feels like you're walking around with a hole in your chest, trying to convince yourself you're fine while everything inside you is bleeding out. But I was tired of bleeding for people who didn't care. I went to work at the library, came home, cooked simple meals, watched television, existed. My friend from book club, Donna, noticed something was wrong. She cornered me one afternoon at the senior center and said, Eleanor, honey, you look like hell. What's going on? I told her everything. The whole story, start to finish. She listened without interrupting, her face growing more and more horrified. When I finished, she said, that girl has lost her damn mind. After everything you did for her. I said, I don't want to talk about it anymore. She said, fair enough. But Eleanor, you can't let her treat you like this. You deserve better. I said, I don't know what I deserve anymore, Donna. She squeezed my hand. You deserve the world, honey. Don't you forget it. But I had forgotten it. I'd forgotten what it felt like to matter. Then, 2 days before Christmas, something happened that changed everything. I got a letter in the mail. Not an email, an actual physical letter, in a manila envelope with a return address I didn't recognize. Some law firm in Pittsburgh. My hands shook as I opened it. My first thought was that something had happened to Linda, or to someone else in my family. But it wasn't that. It was about my Aunt Margaret. Margaret was my father's sister. I hadn't seen her in probably 15 years. She'd moved to Arizona after my uncle died and we'd fallen out of touch. I'd send her a Christmas card every year, and she'd send one back, but that was it. The letter informed me that Margaret had passed away 3 months earlier, and that she'd left me something in her will. Property. 53 acres of land in rural Pennsylvania, about 2 hours north of where I lived. Undeveloped, mostly wooded, sitting on a hillside with views of the valley below. There was an old farmhouse on the property, hadn't been lived in for 20 years, needed extensive repairs, but the land itself was valuable. The letter included an appraisal. The property was worth $340,000. I read that number 3 times before it sank in. $340,000. I sat down hard on my couch, letter still in my hands, and I started laughing. Not happy laughter, the kind of laughter that comes when the universe drops something so absurd in your lap you don't know what else to do. I owned property. I owned $340,000 worth of property. And Rachel had no idea. Nobody did. The lawyer's letter said I needed to sign some papers and come to Pittsburgh to finalize the transfer. I called the law firm the next day and set up an appointment for the week after Christmas. That week was the longest of my life. I didn't tell anyone about the inheritance. Not Linda, not Donna, and definitely not Rachel. I just went about my days, carrying this secret like a ticking bomb. When I finally went to Pittsburgh and signed the papers, the lawyer, a kind older man named Mr. Hendricks, walked me through everything. The property was mine, free and clear. No mortgage, no liens, nothing. Margaret had owned it outright and now it was mine. Mr. Hendricks said, "You have a few options here, Ms. Brennan. You could sell it, of course. The market for land like this is strong right now. Or you could hold on to it as an investment. Or, if you were feeling ambitious, you could renovate the farmhouse and live there yourself." I said, "How much would renovations cost?" He said, "Depends on how much you want to do. If you're just looking to make it livable, basic repairs, updating electrical and plumbing, you're probably looking at $50,000 to $70,000. If you want to do a full renovation, you're looking at more like $100,000 or more." I did the math in my head. If I sold the property for $340,000 and used $70,000 for renovations on a different, smaller place, or if I renovated the farmhouse itself, I'd still have money left over. Enough to live on comfortably for years. Enough to never have to depend on Rachel again. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. I drove up to the property the next day. It took me 2 hours on winding country roads, past small towns and farms and stretches of forest. When I finally found the turnoff, an unmarked dirt road that was easy to miss, my heart was pounding. I drove slowly up the road, branches scraping against my car, until I reached a clearing. And there it was. The farmhouse sat in the middle of the clearing, a 2-story structure with faded white paint and a sagging porch. The windows were boarded up, the roof had holes, and the whole thing looked like it might collapse if you breathed on it too hard. But the land. The land was beautiful. 53 acres of rolling hills and dense forest, with a creek running through the eastern edge. I walked around for over an hour, taking it all in. The silence was profound, no traffic noise, no neighbors, just wind in the trees and birds calling to each other. I stood at the top of the hill and looked out over the valley below, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. This was mine. All mine. And nobody could take it away from me. I drove home that evening with my mind racing. I could sell it, take the money, and disappear. Move somewhere warm, somewhere far away from Rachel and Gregory and all the pain they'd caused. Or I could stay. I could fix up the farmhouse, make it livable, and build a life here. A life that was entirely my own. I thought about it for days. Weighed my options. And then, one night in early January, I made my decision. I was going to renovate the farmhouse. I was going to move out there, away from the city, away from Rachel, away from everything that reminded me of the life I used to have. And I wasn't going to tell Rachel about any of it. Let her think I was still living in the apartment she paid for, still dependent on her charity. Let her think she still had power over me. She'd find out the truth eventually. But by then, it would be too late. I started making plans. I met with contractors, got estimates, figured out what needed to be done first. The house needed a new roof, new windows, updated electrical, new plumbing. The kitchen was a disaster. The bathroom was worse. But it was all fixable. I sold some of the land, 10 acres on the western edge that I didn't need, to a developer for $65,000. That gave me the cash I needed for the initial renovations without having to touch the rest of my inheritance. By February, I had a crew working on the house. New roof went on first. Then windows. Then they started on the interior, ripping out old wiring, replacing pipes, fixing the foundation. I drove up every week to check on the progress. Watched the house slowly transform from a wreck into something livable. Something beautiful. And I didn't tell a soul. Rachel kept calling. I answered occasionally, just often enough to keep her from showing up at my apartment. Our conversations were brief, strained. She'd ask how I was and I'd say fine. She'd try to apologize for Thanksgiving and I'd change the subject. She'd ask if we could have lunch and I'd say I was busy. I was busy. Busy building a life she knew nothing about. By April, the house was livable. Not finished, there was still work to be done on the interior, still rooms that needed paint and floors that needed refinishing, but the essentials were done. I could move in. I gave notice on my apartment. Told the landlord I was moving in with a friend. I didn't tell Rachel. I packed up my belongings, didn't take much, I didn't own much, and moved them up to the farmhouse over the course of a weekend. Donna helped me. She was the only person I told about the property, and I swore her to secrecy. She stood in the middle of the farmhouse living room, looking around, and said, "Eleanor, this is incredible. You did this all by yourself." I said, "I did." She said, "And Rachel doesn't know." I said, "No." She said, "When are you going to tell her?" I said, "When she figures it out herself." Donna looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You're not planning on telling her at all, are you?" I said, "She'll find out eventually." And I smiled. Because I knew exactly how she'd find out. And it was going to destroy her. If you've ever kept a secret from someone who thought they knew everything about your life, you know that feeling, the thrill of it, the power of it. Leave a comment if you've ever had a moment where you realized you held all the cards and the person who hurt you had no idea what was coming. And if you're hooked on this story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and check the description box for more stories about reclaiming your power when everyone thinks you've lost it. I spent the spring and early summer fixing up the farmhouse and learning how to live alone in the middle of nowhere. It was harder than I expected. Not the physical work, though that was exhausting enough, but the solitude. After a lifetime of city noise and neighbors and constant motion, the silence of the countryside was almost oppressive at first. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning to absolute quiet, and it felt like being underwater. But slowly, I adjusted. I learned to love the sound of the creek, the way the wind moved through the trees, the chorus of frogs at night. I planted a small garden behind the house, tomatoes, peppers, herbs, flowers. I bought a rocking chair for the porch and sat there in the evenings, watching the sun set over the valley. I felt more at peace than I had in years. I still answered Rachel's calls occasionally. She'd phone every couple of weeks, and I'd pick up just often enough to keep her from getting suspicious. Our conversations followed the same pattern every time. "How are you, Mom?" "Fine." "How's the apartment?" "Fine." "Are you eating okay? Do you need anything?" "No, I'm fine." "I'd really like to see you. Can we have lunch sometime?" "I'm busy right now, Rachel. Maybe another time." I could hear the frustration in her voice, the confusion. She didn't understand why I was being so distant. But she didn't push too hard. I think part of her was relieved that I wasn't making demands, wasn't asking for more money or more attention. She had no idea I didn't need her anymore. In June, I started volunteering at a small community center in the nearest town, about 20 minutes from my property. It was a way to stay connected, to not become a complete hermit. I helped organize a weekly senior lunch program and assisted with a summer reading program for kids. That's where I met James. James was 71, a retired carpenter with kind eyes and a beard that was more white than gray. He'd lost his wife 2 years earlier and was still figuring out how to live without her. We bonded over being alone, over understanding what it felt like to lose the life you thought you'd have. We started having coffee together after the senior lunch program. Just talking. Nothing romantic, just companionship. It was nice. It was easy. It was everything my relationship with Rachel used to be but wasn't anymore. One afternoon in early July, I was working in my garden when I heard a car coming up the dirt road. My heart jumped. Very few people knew where I lived, and nobody just stumbled onto this property by accident. The road wasn't marked, wasn't on most GPS systems. I stood up, wiping dirt from my hands, and watched as a sleek black SUV came into view. My stomach dropped. I knew that car. I'd seen it parked in Rachel's driveway. Rachel was here. The SUV pulled into the clearing and stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. I stood there frozen, my mind racing. How did she find me? How did she know? Then the driver's door opened, and Rachel got out. But she wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the house. At the property. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock. She turned slowly in a circle, taking it all in. The farmhouse with its fresh coat of white paint, the garden, the new fence I'd built around the clearing, the acres of land stretching out in every direction. Then she saw me. Mom. Her voice was barely a whisper. I didn't move. Didn't speak. Just stood there with my hands covered in dirt, waiting. She walked toward me slowly, like she wasn't sure I was real. Mom, what is this? Where are we? I said, my home. She stopped. Your, what? I said, this is my property. My house. She looked back at the farmhouse, then at me again. I don't understand. You live here? How? When did you? I said, I inherited it. From my Aunt Margaret. Back in December. Her face went through a dozen emotions in as many seconds. Confusion, shock, disbelief, and then, anger. December? You've known about this since December and you didn't tell me. I said, that's right. Why? Why wouldn't you tell me? I said, why would I? She flinched like I'd slapped her. Because I'm your daughter. Because, she stopped, looked around again. How did you afford to fix it up? This had to cost. I said, I sold some of the land. 10 acres. Got enough to cover the renovations. You sold? She pressed her hands to her face. When she dropped them, her eyes were filled with tears. Mom, I don't understand. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me think you were still in that apartment? I said, you mean the apartment you were paying for? The one that let you feel good about yourself? She said, that's not fair. I said, isn't it? She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. I've been worried about you. Calling you, checking in, making sure you were okay. And this whole time you were here, living in this place? Why, Mom? Why would you do this? I said, because I didn't want to need you anymore. The words hung in the air between us, sharp and brutal. Rachel's face crumpled. She said, is that what you think? That I wanted you to need me? I said, didn't you? It made you feel generous. Made you feel like a good daughter. As long as I was struggling, as long as I needed your help, you could tell yourself you were doing the right thing. She said, that's not true. I love you. I wanted to help you because I love you. I said, you love me so much you gave Patricia $200,000 and gave me scraps. You love me so much you invited me to Thanksgiving just to watch you worship her. You love me so much you called me a failure when I asked you for help. She said, I apologized for that. I've tried to make it right. I said, by throwing money at me? By paying my rent and giving me an allowance like I'm a child? That's not making it right, Rachel. That's buying your way out of guilt. She was sobbing now, full-body sobs that shook her shoulders. She said, what do you want from me? Tell me what you want and I'll do it. I'll do anything. I said, I don't want anything from you. That's the point. She said, no, you don't mean that. I said, I've never meant anything more. She looked at me for a long moment, tears streaming down her face. Then she said, voice breaking, how did I lose you? How did we get here? I said, you chose her over me. Every single time, you chose her. She said, that's not. I said, when you had to decide between helping your mother and impressing your mother-in-law, you chose her. When you had to decide between spending time with me and spending time with Gregory's family, you chose them. When you had to decide whether my feelings mattered, you chose to ignore them. So don't stand here and act like you don't know what happened. You know exactly what happened. She said, I made mistakes. I know I did. But I'm trying, Mom. Can't you see that I'm trying? I said, too little, too late. She stared at me, and I saw the moment she realized I meant it. The moment she understood that whatever we'd had was broken beyond repair. She said, voice small, so that's it? You're just done with me. I said, you were done with me first. You just didn't realize it. She wiped her face with shaking hands. She said, how did you even find this place? How did you know I'd drive by? And then I understood. She wasn't here because she'd been looking for me. She was here by accident. She'd been driving through the area, maybe visiting a property for work, maybe just taking a scenic route, and she'd happened to pass by my road and seen the farmhouse and recognized my car parked outside. This wasn't a planned confrontation. This was fate. Or irony. Or the universe's sense of humor. I said, you just happened to drive by. She nodded, still crying. I was looking at a property for a client about 10 miles from here. I took a back road to avoid traffic and I saw your car parked up this driveway and I thought I was seeing things. So I turned around and drove up here and... She gestured helplessly at the farmhouse. And here you are. I almost laughed. After everything, after all my careful planning and secrecy, she'd found out by sheer dumb luck. She said, does anyone else know? Does Linda know? I said, no. Just a friend from town. She said, so you've been living here for months, lying to me every time we talked, and you weren't ever going to tell me? I said, eventually, you would have figured it out. She said, when? When, Mom? I said, when you stopped paying rent on an apartment I wasn't living in. Her eyes widened. You're not. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands, started scrolling through something. Her face went white. Oh my God. You moved out. You moved out months ago and you've just been letting me pay rent on an empty apartment. I said, you wanted to help me. I let you help. She said, voice rising, that's fraud, Mom. That's... I said, it's your money. You can do whatever you want with it. If you want to pay rent on an empty apartment, that's your choice. She looked at me like she didn't know who I was. And maybe she didn't. Maybe I'd changed so much in the past year that I wasn't the mother she remembered. Good. She said, I need to go. I said, okay. Tell him. I said, tell him whatever you want. She looked at me one more time, her face a mask of pain and confusion, and then she turned and walked back to her car. She got in. Started the engine. And then she just sat there, phone pressed to her ear. I could see her talking, see her getting more and more agitated. Even from 50 feet away, I could tell she was crying, shouting, her face flushed with emotion. She was calling Gregory. Or maybe Patricia. Telling them what she'd found. Telling them I'd lied, that I'd been hiding this from her, that I'd let her pay for an apartment I wasn't living in. I watched her for a moment, then turned and walked back to my garden. I heard her car door open. Heard her shouting. You need to see this. You need to come up here right now. She's been lying to us. She has property. She has land. She's been playing us this whole time. Her voice carried across the clearing, shrill and desperate. I kept working in my garden. Pulling weeds. Watering plants. Pretending she wasn't there. After a few more minutes of shouting into her phone, she got back in her car and drove away, tires spinning in the dirt. I stood up and watched her SUV disappear down the road. And I smiled. Because now the real show was about to begin. Rachel called me 63 times over the next 2 days. I know because I counted. 63 calls I let go to voicemail. 63 messages I deleted without listening to. On the third day, Gregory called. Then Patricia. Then Charles. I blocked all their numbers. On the fourth day, Rachel showed up again. This time she wasn't alone. Gregory was with her. I was on the porch when they pulled up, sitting in my rocking chair with a glass of iced tea, watching the sunset. I'd been expecting this. Gregory got out first. He was wearing khakis and a polo shirt, his usual weekend uniform. His face was hard, jaw clenched. Rachel climbed out behind him, looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were red and swollen, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. They walked toward the porch. Gregory said, "Eleanor, we need to talk." I took a sip of my tea. "No, we don't." He said, "Yes. We do. This situation has gotten completely out of hand." I said, "What situation would that be?" Rachel said, voice hoarse, "Mom, please. Please just talk to us." I said, "I'm listening." Gregory said, "You lied to us. You've been lying for months." I said, "I didn't lie. You assumed things. I just didn't correct you." He said, "You let Rachel pay rent on an apartment you weren't living in. That's fraud." I said, "Is it? Did I sign a lease? Did I make any promises? Or did Rachel just decide to pay my rent without asking if I wanted her to?" Rachel said, "You let me. You let me think you needed my help." I said, "You needed to think I needed your help. There's a difference." She made a frustrated sound, halfway between a sob and a scream. "Why are you doing this? Why are you being so cruel?" I said, "Cruel? You want to talk about cruel? Let's talk about you calling me a failure. Let's talk about you giving Patricia everything and giving me scraps. Let's talk about cruel, Rachel." Gregory said, "This isn't about Patricia." I said, "It's always about Patricia. Every decision you make is about keeping her happy. And Rachel goes along with it because she'd rather be part of your family than remember she has a mother who actually raised her." Gregory's face flushed. He said, "My mother has been nothing but supportive." I said, "Your mother is a manipulative, entitled snob who looks down on anyone who didn't grow up with a trust fund. And you, Gregory, are so far up her ass you can't see daylight." Rachel gasped. "Mom." I said, "What? You want honesty? There's your honesty." Gregory said, voice tight, "I'm not going to stand here and be insulted." I said, "Then leave." He looked at Rachel. She was crying again, shoulders shaking. He put his arm around her and said, "Come on. We're going." But Rachel didn't move. She said, "No. No. I'm not leaving until she tells me what she wants." "What do you want, Mom? You want me to pay you back? Fine. I'll pay you back. Every penny I spent on your rent. Just tell me what you want." I said, "I don't want your money." She said, "Then what? What do you want?" I set down my iced tea and stood up. Looked her right in the eyes. I said, "I want you to feel what I felt." She said, "What?" I said, "I want you to know what it's like to give everything to someone and have them treat you like you're worthless. I want you to understand what it feels like to watch someone you love choose other people over you, again and again and again. I want you to lie awake at night wondering what you did wrong, wondering why you weren't enough." My voice cracked on that last word. I hadn't meant for it to. But 3 years of pain came flooding back and I couldn't stop it. I said, "You broke my heart, Rachel. You took everything I gave you, all those years, all that sacrifice, and you acted like it meant nothing. Like I meant nothing. And then you tried to buy me back with an apartment and a monthly allowance, like I was some charity case you could check off your list." Rachel was sobbing openly now. She said, "I never meant, I didn't know." I said, "You didn't want to know. It was easier to believe Patricia was the wonderful, generous mother figure and I was just the failure who couldn't get her life together. It fit the narrative you wanted." Gregory said, "Eleanor, that's not fair." I turned on him. "You don't get to talk about fair. You stood there at Thanksgiving and watched your mother insult me, and you said nothing. You let her treat me like garbage in your house, and you did nothing. So don't talk to me about fair." He said, "My mother was just." I said, "Your mother is a vicious woman who's convinced she's better than everyone else. And you and Rachel enable her because you're too weak to stand up to her." Rachel said, "Stop it. Just stop. Why are you saying these things?" I said, "Because someone needs to. Because you need to hear it. You need to understand what you did." She said, "I know what I did. I know I hurt you. And I'm sorry. How many times do I have to say it?" I said, "Sorry doesn't fix this." She said, "Then what will? Tell me what will fix this." I said, "Nothing. It's broken, Rachel. We're broken. And I don't think we can be fixed." The silence that followed was crushing. I could hear the creak in the distance, birds settling in for the night, the wind moving through the trees. But between us, there was just silence and the sound of Rachel crying. Finally, Gregory said, voice cold, fine. If that's how you want it. But you're going to give Rachel back the money she spent on that apartment. I said, no, I'm not. He said, you can't just take our money. I said, I didn't take anything. Rachel gave it freely. I never asked for it. I never signed anything. She decided to pay for an apartment without checking to see if I was actually living there. That's on her. Gregory said, we'll sue you. I laughed. Actually laughed. I said, sue me for what? For letting you throw money at me? Good luck with that. He said, you're a spiteful, bitter old woman. I said, and you're a spineless trust fund baby who's never had to work for anything in his life. I guess we both have our flaws. His face went purple. He grabbed Rachel's arm and said, we're leaving. Now. But Rachel pulled away from him. She walked up the porch steps until she was standing right in front of me. Her face was inches from mine, tears streaming down her cheeks. She said, voice breaking, I love you. I have always loved you. And I'm sorry I made you feel like you didn't matter. I'm sorry I hurt you. I'm sorry for all of it. But, Mom, you have to know. You have to know that none of this was about you not being enough. You were always enough. You were everything. I felt tears burning in my own eyes, but I blinked them back. I said, if I was everything, you wouldn't have needed her. She said, I didn't need her. I wanted her to like me. I wanted to be part of Gregory's family. And I got so caught up in trying to fit into their world that I forgot about the woman who actually raised me. The woman who gave me everything. I said, and now? She said, now I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to make you believe me. I said, you can't. She closed her eyes, fresh tears spilling out. She said, so that's it? We're just done. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to hold on to my anger, my righteous fury, and push her away for good. But standing there, looking at my daughter's broken face, I felt something crack inside me. I said, voice barely a whisper, I don't know. She opened her eyes. What? I said, I don't know if we're done. I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. But I don't know if I can let you go, either. She said, then don't. Please, Mom. Don't let me go. I said, Rachel, you let me go first. 3 years ago, you let me go. And I can't just pretend that didn't happen. She said, I know. But I'm here now. I'm here and I'm asking, I'm begging you to give me another chance. I looked at her, really looked at her. And I saw not the polished, successful woman she'd become, but the little girl she used to be. The one who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. The one who used to hold my hand crossing the street. The one who used to tell me I was the best mom in the world. That little girl was still in there somewhere, buried under years of ambition and social climbing and trying to be someone she thought she needed to be. But she was still there. I said, I need time. She said, okay. Take all the time you need. I said, and things have to change. You have to change. You can't keep putting Patricia first. You can't keep acting like her feelings matter more than mine. She said, I won't. I promise. Gregory called from the driveway, Rachel, we need to go. She turned to him and said, give me a minute. He said, we've been here long enough. She said, voice sharp, I said give me a minute. He looked shocked. I don't think Rachel had ever spoken to him like that before. She turned back to me. She said, I'm going to prove it to you. I'm going to prove that you matter. That you've always mattered. I said, how? She said, I don't know yet. But I'll figure it out. She reached for my hand. I let her take it. Her skin was warm, familiar. For a moment, I was transported back to when she was 7 years old, holding my hand in the grocery store, chattering about her day at school. God, I miss that little girl. Rachel squeezed my hand and said, I love you, Mom. I said, I know. She waited, like she was hoping I'd say it back. But I couldn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She let go of my hand and walked back to the car. Gregory was already in the driver's seat, engine running. Rachel got in and they drove away. I stood on the porch for a long time after they left, watching the sky turn from orange to purple to black. Fireflies started appearing in the clearing, little sparks of light in the darkness. My phone rang. I looked at the screen. Linda. I answered. Hey. Linda said, Eleanor, what the hell is going on? Rachel just called me sobbing, saying you've been living on some property you inherited and didn't tell anyone, and that you're refusing to talk to her, and, is any of this true? I sighed. It's complicated. She said, well, uncomplicate it for me. So I did. I told her everything, the inheritance, the renovations, the months of silence, Rachel's accidental discovery, the confrontations. All of it. When I finished, Linda was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Jesus, Eleanor. You've been carrying all this by yourself. I said, I didn't want to burden anyone. She said, I'm your sister. You're supposed to burden me. I laughed despite myself. I'll try to remember that. She said, so what are you going to do? About Rachel, I mean. I said, I don't know. Part of me wants to cut her off completely. Part of me wants to forgive her and pretend none of this happened. And part of me just wants to disappear into these woods and never deal with any of it again. Linda said, you know what I think? I said, what? She said, I think you need to let her earn her way back. Don't make it easy. Don't just forgive and forget. Make her prove that she's changed. Make her prove that she understands what she did and why it was wrong. I said, and if she can't? Linda said, then you have your answer. We talked for another hour, about everything and nothing. It felt good to talk to someone who knew me, who understood where I came from, who didn't judge me for being angry. When we hung up, I went inside and made myself dinner. Sat at my small kitchen table and ate in silence. And I thought about what Linda had said. Make her earn it. Yeah. I could do that. But first, I needed to see just how far Rachel was willing to go. If you've ever made someone prove they deserved a second chance, or if you've had to prove it yourself, you know how complicated that territory is. Nothing about forgiveness is simple. Drop a comment and let me know. Do you think some relationships can be repaired, or are some betrayals just too deep? And if you're still with me on this journey, make sure you've subscribed and checked out the description box below for more stories about the messy, painful, beautiful work of rebuilding what's been broken. 3 weeks passed without a word from Rachel. No calls. No texts. No surprise visits. Just silence. At first, I thought she'd given up. That she'd decided I was too difficult, too bitter, too broken, and she'd gone back to her perfect life with Gregory and Patricia and pretended I didn't exist. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. Even after everything, even after all the anger and pain, some part of me had hoped she'd fight harder. That I'd mattered enough for her to keep trying. But then, on a Thursday morning in late August, I found an envelope in my mailbox. No return address. Just my name written in Rachel's handwriting. I stood at the end of my driveway, holding that envelope, my hands shaking. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to read whatever excuse or apology or justification she'd written. I'd heard it all before. But I opened it anyway. Inside was a letter. 5 pages, handwritten, every line filled with Rachel's careful script. I walked back to the house and sat on the porch, took a deep breath, and started reading. Mom, I know you probably don't want to hear from me. I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But I need to say some things, and I need you to hear them, even if you never forgive me. I've spent the last 3 weeks thinking about everything you said. About how I treated you. About the choices I made. And you were right about all of it. I did choose Patricia over you. I did prioritize Gregory's family over my own. And I did it because it was easier. Because Patricia's approval felt like validation that I'd made it, that I'd become someone important. Someone successful. Someone worth something. But the truth is, I've always been worth something. Because you made me worth something. You sacrificed everything so I could have a better life, and instead of honoring that, I threw it in your face. I called you a failure. God, Mom, I called you a failure. The woman who worked 3 jobs so I could have school supplies. The woman who went without so I could have more. The woman who raised me by herself and never once made me feel like I was a burden. Asterisk, you weren't the failure. I was. Asterisk. Asterisk, I failed to see what you'd given me. I failed to appreciate the life you built for us out of nothing. I failed to be the daughter you deserved. Asterisk. Asterisk, and when you called me, when you needed my help, I treated you like you were asking for something unreasonable. Like you were the problem. When the truth is, I was ashamed. I was ashamed that my mother was struggling while I was living in luxury. I was ashamed that I couldn't fix your life the way you'd fixed mine. And instead of dealing with that shame, I lashed out at you. Asterisk. Asterisk, I made you the villain in my story so I didn't have to be the villain in yours. Asterisk. Asterisk, the last 3 weeks have been hell, Mom. Gregory and I have been fighting constantly. He doesn't understand why I'm so upset. He keeps saying you manipulated me, that you're playing games, that you're trying to make me feel guilty. Asterisk. Asterisk, but he's wrong. You didn't manipulate me. You just finally stopped letting me treat you like you didn't matter. Asterisk. Asterisk, I told Patricia what happened. About your property, about the apartment, about everything you said to me. I thought she'd be sympathetic. I thought she'd understand. Asterisk. Asterisk, she didn't. Asterisk. Asterisk, she said, and I quote, well, if Eleanor had managed her life better, she wouldn't need to play these games for attention. Asterisk. Asterisk, and something inside me snapped. Asterisk. Asterisk, I looked at this woman I'd been trying so hard to please, this woman I'd given so much to, and I realized she doesn't care about me. Not really. She cares about what I can give her. The money, the apartment, the social status of having a successful daughter-in-law. But she doesn't actually care about me as a person. Asterisk. Asterisk, you do. You always have. Even when I didn't deserve it. Asterisk. Asterisk, I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not asking you to let me back into your life. I'm just asking you to know that I finally understand. I understand what I did. I understand what I lost. And I understand that it's my fault. Asterisk. Asterisk, I love you, Mom. I have always loved you. And I'm so sorry. Asterisk. Asterisk, Rachel. Asterisk. I read the letter 3 times. By the 3rd time, I was crying. Not because the letter fixed anything. It didn't. Words on paper couldn't undo 3 years of pain and neglect. But it was a start. It was acknowledgement. It was accountability. It was the first time Rachel had truly looked at her own behavior and called it what it was. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. Then I sat on my porch and watched the sun climb higher in the sky. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to call Rachel immediately, tell her I'd received the letter, tell her we could try to rebuild. But another part of me, the part that had been hurt too many times, wanted to wait. To see if this newfound clarity lasted or if it was just another temporary burst of guilt that would fade as soon as life got comfortable again. So I waited. 2 days later, Linda called. She said, Eleanor, have you talked to Rachel lately? I said, no. Why? She said, she called me yesterday. She's making some big changes. I sat up straighter. What kind of changes? Linda said, she stopped paying for Patricia's apartment. My heart skipped. What? Linda said, she told Patricia she couldn't afford to keep paying $8,000 a month anymore, and that Patricia needed to make other arrangements. From what Rachel told me, Patricia lost her mind. There was a huge fight. Gregory's taking his mother's side, obviously. Rachel said it's been causing major problems in her marriage. I said, she stopped paying for the apartment. Linda said, and that's not all. She told Patricia she couldn't keep funding her lifestyle. No more shopping trips, no more dinners, none of it. She said she needs to prioritize her own family. I couldn't speak. Couldn't process what I was hearing. Linda said, Eleanor, you still there? I said, yeah, I'm here. Linda said, Rachel's trying, honey. She's really trying. I said, it might be too late. Linda said, maybe. But at least she's trying. After we hung up, I sat in the silence of my farmhouse and tried to figure out what I was feeling. Relief? Vindication? Fear that this was temporary, that Rachel would change her mind once the pressure from Gregory and Patricia became too much? All of the above. That night, my phone rang. Rachel. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then answered. Mom. Her voice was thick, like she'd been crying. Did Linda tell you? I said, she told me. Rachel said, I should have done it years ago. I should have stood up to her. To all of them. I said, why now? She said, because you were right. About everything. Patricia doesn't care about me. She cares about what I can do for her. And I've been so desperate for her approval that I couldn't see it. I said, and Gregory? She laughed bitterly. Gregory thinks I've lost my mind. He says I'm throwing away his mother's security because I'm angry at you. He doesn't get it. He doesn't understand that this isn't about anger. It's about finally seeing things clearly. I said, Rachel, if you're doing this to win me back. She said, I'm not. I mean, I am, but that's not the only reason. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. Because I can't keep living a lie. I can't keep pretending that buying people's love is the same thing as earning it. I said, what did Patricia say? Rachel said, things I'm not going to repeat. Let's just say she made it very clear what she thinks of me now that I'm not useful anymore. I said, I'm sorry. She said, don't be. I needed to hear it. I needed to see who she really is. We were quiet for a moment. Then Rachel said, Mom, I know I can't fix this overnight. I know I have a lot to prove. But I want to try. If you'll let me. I said, I got your letter. She said, and? I said, it was a good letter. She laughed, a sound somewhere between relief and tears. Just good. I said, it was honest. That's more than I've gotten from you in a long time. She said, I want to be honest with you from now on. About everything. No more hiding. No more pretending. I said, okay. She said, okay. I said, okay. We can try. She started crying. I could hear it through the phone, big, gasping sobs of relief. Thank you. Thank you, Mom. I won't let you down. I promise. I said, don't make promises, Rachel. Just, show up. That's all I need. Just show up. She said, I will. I'll show up every day if I have to. We talked for another hour. About everything and nothing. About her fights with Gregory, about her guilt over Patricia, about her fear that she'd ruined everything beyond repair. And for the first time in 3 years, I felt like I was talking to my daughter again. Not the polished, distant woman she'd become, but the girl I'd raised. The girl who used to tell me everything, who used to trust me with her fears and dreams. She was still in there. She'd just been lost for a while. When we hung up, I sat in the darkness of my living room and cried. Not from sadness, but from something else. Something that felt almost like hope. Maybe we could fix this. Maybe it wasn't too late. Or maybe I was setting myself up to be hurt all over again. I didn't know. But I was willing to find out. The next 3 months were a test. For both of us. Rachel came to visit me every Sunday. At first, the visits were awkward, stilted conversations about the weather and the garden and nothing that really mattered. But slowly, carefully, we started talking about real things. About her childhood, about the years after her father left, about the sacrifices I'd made and how she'd never fully understood them until now. She told me about her marriage, about how Gregory had grown cold and distant since she'd stopped paying for Patricia's apartment. He'd told her she was being unreasonable, that she was betraying his family, that she'd changed into someone he didn't recognize. She told him that maybe the person she'd been before, the person who threw money at problems and bought her way into acceptance, wasn't someone worth recognizing. They were in counseling now. Rachel wasn't sure the marriage would survive, but she was trying. Trying to figure out who she was outside of Gregory's world, outside of Patricia's expectations. It was painful to watch. But it was also necessary. In October, Patricia showed up at Rachel's house unannounced. Rachel told me about it the following Sunday, sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee, her hands shaking as she relived it. Patricia had demanded to know why Rachel was abandoning her, why she was being so cruel, why she was choosing me over her. Rachel had said, I'm not choosing Eleanor over you. I'm choosing honesty over performance. And if you can't understand that, then we don't have anything else to talk about. Patricia had left in a fury. Gregory had screamed at Rachel for hours afterward. But Rachel had held her ground. I was proud of her. Terrified for her. But proud. By November, things with Gregory had reached a breaking point. He'd given Rachel an ultimatum. Apologize to his mother and restore her financial support, or he was done. Rachel called me that night, crying so hard she could barely speak. "Mom, I don't know what to do. I love him. But I can't go back to the way things were. I can't." I said, "Then don't." She said, "But what if I lose him?" I said, "Rachel, if he's making you choose between having a backbone and keeping him happy, then he's not worth keeping." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You're right. I know you're right. But it still hurts." I said, "I know, baby. I know." The divorce papers were filed in early December. Rachel moved into a small apartment in the city. Nothing like the house she'd shared with Gregory, but it was hers. She'd taken a leave of absence from work to figure out her next steps, to deal with the emotional fallout of watching her marriage implode. She came to stay with me for a week in mid-December. We decorated my farmhouse for Christmas. A small tree in the living room, lights strung along the porch, stockings hung on the mantel. It was simple, nothing like the elaborate decorations she used to put up with Gregory, but it felt real. It felt like home. One night, we were sitting by the fireplace, drinking hot chocolate, and Rachel said, "Mom, do you regret it? Pushing me away? Making me work so hard to get you back?" I thought about it. Really thought about it. Then I said, "No. Because if I hadn't, you never would have learned. You never would have understood what you did, or why it mattered. You would have just kept throwing money at the problem and thinking that was enough." She said, "I lost my marriage because of it." I said, "No, honey. You lost your marriage because it was built on a foundation that couldn't hold. If Gregory loved you, really loved you, he would have supported you when you stood up for yourself. He would have been proud of you for choosing integrity over comfort. But he didn't. He chose his mother over you. Just like you used to choose her over me." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "Do you think I made the right choice?" I said, "I think you made the only choice you could live with. And that's what matters." She leaned against me and I wrapped my arm around her, and for the first time in years, it felt right. It felt like we were supposed to be here, together, figuring out how to move forward. On Christmas Eve, Linda and her family drove up to spend the holiday with us. My farmhouse was full of noise and laughter and chaos, kids running around, adults talking over each other, everyone pitching in to cook dinner. Rachel fit right in. She played with Linda's kids, helped in the kitchen, laughed at our stupid family jokes. She looked lighter than I'd seen her in years. Like she'd been carrying a weight she didn't even know was there, and now it was gone. After dinner, after Linda's family had gone to bed in the guest room, Rachel and I sat on the porch in the cold December air, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars. She said, "Thank you." I said, "For what?" She said, "For not giving up on me. For making me work for this. For loving me enough to let me go so I could find my way back." I said, "You're my daughter, Rachel. I never stopped loving you. Even when I was angry, even when I couldn't stand to talk to you, I never stopped." She said, "I know. And I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that." We sat in silence for a while, just breathing in the cold air and listening to the night sounds of the countryside. Then Rachel said, "I'm thinking about moving up here. Not with you, I need my own space. But there's a small house for sale about 10 minutes from here. 2 bedrooms, needs some work, but it's affordable. I could fix it up, take my time figuring out what I want to do next." I said, "You want to move out here? Away from the city?" She said, "I want to be closer to you. I want to rebuild our relationship. And I think I need to get away from everything that reminds me of who I was trying to be." I said, "What about work?" She said, "I'm thinking about starting my own consulting firm. Something small. Something I can do from anywhere. I don't want to go back to that high-pressure corporate world. I don't want to be that person anymore." I looked at her, my daughter, sitting there in the darkness, planning a future that looked nothing like the life she'd built, and I felt something shift inside me. Pride. Not the complicated, painful pride I'd felt watching her succeed in a world I didn't understand, but simple, uncomplicated pride in who she was becoming. I said, "I think that sounds perfect." She smiled, and in that smile, I saw the little girl I'd raised. The one who used to believe she could do anything. The one who used to trust me to guide her. She'd been lost for a while. But she was finding her way back. And maybe, just maybe, we were both finding our way home. Rachel bought the house in February. It was a modest place, 2 bedrooms, one bathroom, a small kitchen that needed updating, hardwood floors that needed refinishing. Nothing like the mansion she'd lived in with Gregory, but she loved it. She said it felt honest. Like she could be herself there, without pretending to be someone she wasn't. She spent the spring fixing it up. I helped when I could, holding tools, painting walls, offering advice when she asked. We worked side by side, the way I'd always imagined we would when she was younger, before life pulled us in different directions. Her divorce from Gregory was finalized in March. It was ugly, fights over assets, over money, over who got what. Patricia had apparently convinced Gregory that Rachel owed them for all the support they'd given her over the years. Rachel's lawyer had laughed at that and told Gregory's lawyer that gifts don't come with strings attached. In the end, Rachel kept the money she'd earned, Gregory kept the house and most of his family's investments, and they went their separate ways. Patricia never spoke to Rachel again. Rachel said she was fine with that. I believed her. By April, Rachel had settled into her new life. She'd launched her consulting firm, small at first, just a few clients, but it was growing. She worked from home most days, took walks in the woods, came over for dinner twice a week. We fell into a rhythm. A comfortable, easy rhythm that felt nothing like the strained, performative relationship we'd had before. We talked about real things, our fears, our regrets, our hopes for the future. We didn't agree on everything, but we listened to each other. We respected each other. One afternoon in May, we were sitting on my porch, our usual spot, when Rachel said, "Mom, I need to tell you something." I looked at her. Her face was serious, but not scared. Just thoughtful. I said, "What is it?" She said, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened. About why I acted the way I did. And I realized something." I said, "What?" She said, "I was ashamed of you. Not because of anything you did, but because of what your life represented. You struggled. You were broke. You lived in a tiny rental house and worked minimum wage jobs and barely got by. And in the world I was living in, Gregory's world, that was seen as failure." She looked at me, eyes shining with unshed tears. I internalized that. I let their values become my values. And I started seeing you the way they saw you, as someone who hadn't made the right choices, who hadn't built a secure life. And I was ashamed. Ashamed that my mother wasn't successful by their standards. Ashamed that I came from struggle instead of privilege. I said, "Rachel." She said, "Let me finish. Please." I nodded. She said, "But you know what? You weren't the failure. You were the success story. You took nothing and made something. You raised a kid by yourself on a nurse's aide salary and sent her to college debt-free. You survived when most people would have given up. And instead of recognizing that, instead of being proud of where I came from, I tried to erase it. Tried to pretend I'd always been part of their world." Tears were streaming down her face now. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry I was ashamed of you. You're the strongest person I know, and I should have been shouting that from the rooftops instead of hiding you away like you were something to be embarrassed about." I reached over and took her hand. My own eyes were wet. I said, "Thank you for saying that." She said, "I mean it. Every word." We sat there for a long time, holding hands, not saying anything. Sometimes words aren't enough. Sometimes you just need to sit with someone and let them know they're not alone. After a while, Rachel said, "You know what's funny?" I said, "What?" She said, "Patricia used to tell me that family was the most important thing. That's why I needed to support her, why I needed to put her first. But she didn't mean it. She meant family was important as long as they were useful to her. As long as they gave her what she wanted." She squeezed my hand. "But you showed me what family really means. It means showing up even when it's hard. It means loving someone even when they hurt you. It means holding them accountable instead of enabling them. That's real family. And I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that." I said, "You understand it now. That's what matters." She said, "Do you forgive me?" I looked at her, my daughter, my complicated, flawed, beautiful daughter, and I said, "Yes. I forgive you." She started crying in earnest then, big gasping sobs of relief and grief and everything in between. I pulled her into my arms and held her the way I used to when she was small, when the world was too big and scary and all she needed was her mom to make it okay. I couldn't make everything okay. I couldn't undo the years of pain and distance. But I could give her this moment of grace, this promise that we were going to be okay. We sat there on the porch until the sun set, until the fireflies came out, until the world faded into darkness and all that was left was us. Mother and daughter. Finally finding our way back to each other. In June, Rachel and I planted a garden together. Not just at my house, but at hers too. We spent hours in the dirt, planting tomatoes and peppers and herbs, talking about everything and nothing. James started coming around more often. He and Rachel got along well. He treated her like a person, not like someone he needed to impress or win over. She appreciated that. One evening, the three of us were having dinner on my porch when Rachel said, "You know, I used to think success meant having the biggest house and the fanciest car and the most impressive job title. But now I think it just means being able to sit on a porch with people you love and feel at peace." James raised his glass. "I'll drink to that." We all clinked glasses and sat there in the warm summer air, listening to the creek and the frogs and the wind in the trees. It wasn't the life I'd imagined. It wasn't the life Rachel had planned. But it was ours. And it was good. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how things happened. If I regret pushing Rachel away, forcing her to confront who she'd become, making her earn her way back into my life. And the answer is no. Because without that breaking point, without that moment of complete rupture, Rachel never would have changed. She would have kept living the same life, making the same choices, prioritizing the same people. And I would have kept accepting scraps, kept pretending I was fine with being an afterthought. We both needed to break before we could heal. The property, the inheritance from Aunt Margaret, was what saved me. Not just financially, though that certainly helped. But emotionally. It gave me the power to walk away. It gave me the ability to say no to Rachel's charity, to refuse to be dependent on someone who didn't value me. And in doing so, it forced Rachel to look at herself. To see what she'd become. To decide who she wanted to be. It wasn't the property that changed everything, though. It was what I chose to do with it. I chose my dignity. I chose my self-respect. I chose to stop accepting less than I deserved. And that choice, that single, painful, terrifying choice, changed both our lives. It's been a year now since Rachel found out about the property. A year since that confrontation in my driveway, since she stood there screaming into her phone, telling Gregory and Patricia that I'd been lying, that I had land, that I'd been playing them. I think about that moment sometimes. The shock on her face. The betrayal in her voice. The way she couldn't comprehend that I'd built a life without her, that I didn't need her anymore. It was the beginning of everything. Rachel and I talk almost every day now. Sometimes it's just a quick phone call. "How are you, Mom?" "Good, honey. You?" And sometimes it's hours-long conversations about life and regret and hope and healing. She's dating someone new. A teacher from the local high school named Michael. Quiet, kind, nothing like Gregory. He treats her like she matters, not because of what she can give him, but because of who she is. She told me last week that she's happy. Really, truly happy. Maybe for the first time in her adult life. I believe her. As for me, I'm still here in my farmhouse, living my quiet life. I still work at the community center. Still have coffee with James twice a week. Still tend my garden and sit on my porch and watch the seasons change. I'm 64 now. My back still hurts. I still have days when I'm tired and lonely and wondering if I made the right choices. But most days, I'm at peace. Most days, I'm happy. And that's more than I ever thought I'd be able to say. If you've made it this far in my story, thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for witnessing my pain and my anger and my journey back to something that looks like wholeness. I hope you found something in this story that resonated with you. Maybe you've been the daughter who took someone for granted. Maybe you've been the mother who was taken for granted. Maybe you're somewhere in between, trying to figure out how to fix something that feels irreparably broken. All I can tell you is this: it's never too late to choose differently. It's never too late to stand up for yourself, to demand more, to refuse to accept less than you deserve. And it's never too late to come home, to yourself, to the people you love, to the life you were meant to live. My daughter gave her mother-in-law $200,000 and called me a failure. I stopped calling them. 3 years later, she drove past my property and everything changed. But the real story isn't about the money or the property or the revenge. The real story is about a mother and daughter who lost each other and fought their way back. And that's the only story that matters. Before I go, I want to ask you one more time. Please, check the description box below. There are more stories there, stories about survival, about heartbreak, about finding your strength when the world tries to take it from you. Stories that might help you feel less alone in whatever you're going through. And if this story meant something to you, if it made you think about your own relationships, your own choices, your own life, leave a comment. Share your story. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you're struggling with. Tell me what you learned. Because we're all just trying to figure this out. We're all just trying to survive our own heartbreaks and betrayals and losses. And sometimes, just knowing someone else understands can make all the difference. My name is Eleanor Louise Brennan. I'm a mother, a survivor, a woman who refused to disappear when the world told me I didn't matter. And this is my story. Thank you for listening.